Hey guys, Montel here, and welcome to this groundbreaking episode of Free Thinking with Montel. Today, we're exploring a pivotal moment in the fight against multiple sclerosis, a disease that touches millions of lives globally, including my own. First, we're going to talk with Mary Chapman, a 25-year MS survivor and patient advocate, followed by an insightful discussion with Dr. Saida, who is from Johns Hopkins Multiple Sclerosis Center. Mary, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Montel.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about your MS journey. Let's go back to when you were first diagnosed and what drove you in to get a diagnosis.
I was driving down the highway and my right foot wouldn't wake up, so I knew something was wrong, and then pain crawled all the way up from my right toes all the way up to my jawline on the right side. I felt like I was power washed with acid all the way up. So I asked to get referred to a neurologist, and I took myself to the neurologist office a lot of days, and I actually sat in the waiting room and refused to leave until they would find out what was wrong with me. I was 28 years old.
Well, let me pause you for just a second. We'll go back to those initial symptoms because a lot of our listeners are tuning in. Some people who have not been diagnosed yet, or some people who have just been diagnosed, are probably
Okay.
trying to anticipate what's going on with them. When you say it first started off as a numbness, did that last for days, weeks before it turned to pain, or was it numbness that turned to pain immediately while you were in that car ride?
It was it was it was like pins and needles and numbness at the same time.
To begin
So
with,
I'm sorry,
sorry, to begin with, it started off
to
as pins
begin
and
with.
needles. Okay, okay,
Exactly. So like when your foot falls asleep
right.
and you can't wake it up, but I thought it was peculiar because my foot shouldn't have been asleep. It was on the gas pedal actually. And I was thinking, why is my foot asleep? This is so weird. So I kept wiggling my toes, kind of saying like, wake up, foot. Well, this is odd. It shouldn't be asleep. But I wasn't constricting the blood flow.
And was that signal getting through? You were actually wiggling your toes, but you just couldn't feel it.
Yeah, I could feel the wiggling. I just couldn't get the sensation of a normal foot back.
Got it.
Yeah. So the sensations of my foot were pins and needles, acid. I always describe it as acid because as I sit here now, I have that feeling of being doused in acid still to this day, and it's 25 years later.
And a lot of people don't understand, and especially when it comes to neuropathic pain, it hits us all differently. My symptoms really kind of began early on. When they first started, it was optical, but then 20 years later, it became this extreme neuropathic pain, like you're talking about, in my feet, my shins. I got a little patch of it in my side. It kind of skipped my thighs, skipped my midsection, but hit me in the side, hit me again in the face. I had trigeminal neuralgia. And I've often tried to figure out how do I explain it to people. I used to say it used to feel like somebody took a hot poker out of a fireplace and shoved it into my foot because that's how extreme it is. And some people don't seem to understand that can be there and you can still function, but that can be there and we can function. Correct?
Abs- Absolutely. Uh, yeah, it's bad. I mean, it's bad. And I I would go in that neurologist office and they would take safety pins, which, I've had hundreds and hundreds of safety pins dragged across my body, and I couldn't feel that they were dragging them on the right side of my body. Yet I was in excruciating pain, and I had gotten a new puppy, a Sheltie puppy named Oliver, and when his cold nose would touch my foot or my leg, I would scream in pain because the cold signal, including the atmosphere, the air, if it were a little bit colder than room temperature, was so painful to me, and it still is to this day. So,
And,
yeah, it
let me,
hits us
let me, let me
differently.
let me just jump because you're absolutely right. It hits us all. A lot of people don't understand this illness and why it's so insidious is because, I hear you say it multiple times, and I've seen you write it or it's been written in some of your responses where you say my MS. And that's really how I think us individually, we all individually look at it. We are a little different. Like yours is a cold sensitivity. I'll tell you something really kind of crazy. Mine is a heat sensitivity. And my heat sensitivity comes and goes and is worse and better and worse and better. But for the first 10 years after my diagnosis, I would spend time in South America during our winter in North America because I couldn't handle the heat. The hotter it got outside, the more pain it literally would register in my feet. I started feeling the same things that we were talking about when you were talking about pins and needles and them using, safety pins and kind of scratching it across you. Like I tell you, I was in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute, and a doctor did a test where he basically kind of poked me with needles. And I swear to you, I didn't even feel it. I couldn't feel the poke of the needle, but then I could feel it when he put his hand on my foot and squeezed it because his body heat was enough to like just set me on fire.
Exactly, and I understand. You and I have we each one of us has our own set of MS damage, our lesions that short out our signals in our each individual way, and each one causes us our individual pain or and I've been hospitalized 8 times for being disabled or sight impaired and or couldn't use my hands and legs. I mean, or the spasticity where I describe it as piranhas attacking my legs suddenly and knocking me to the ground. I mean, I'm pretty good with the descriptions, the analogies, because I like the doctors to actually understand what I'm going through. It's not easy. I mean, I view myself as a weeble wobble, and I've been knocked down a lot of times, but whoop, you know, you have to be tough, but it is not easy.
No,
I
this is
struggle every day. I mean,
I'm with you. I mean, it's a disease that is insidious, and it's hard for people to really understand what we go through. Like with me, there are times when if I can get distracted from the pain, it's not as, I don't know, perverse or not as bad as it is. And I try to stay distracted most of my day from it. But when I focus in on it and start talking about it, then it almost comes alive. I mean, it's
e
really kind of weird. But
exactly,
people, but people
exactly.
but people don't even understand that. They like, well, I just see you walking. You don't look like you're in pain. Well, now that you just said I'm in pain, thank you, because now you
E
just brought it back.
exactly. One interesting thing that happened to me, Montel, this is really interesting. I was at Johns Hopkins, and there was a woman in a scooter, and we were both in the research center, and she was a darling woman, and I actually don't talk to a lot of people with MS. This is why this is so unbelievably difficult for me because I actually haven't talked about my MS in 25 years. This is brand new to me, and I'm terrified. Talking to you is very comforting, I have to say right now, because I feel like I'm relating to you on a personal level because you and I have similar types of pain, actually, the neuropathic pain. People who look at us can't understand and see the pain. I mean, we have an invisible type of disease unless we're sitting in a scooter or with our walking stick or something. But this woman was in a scooter and I don't have a cane and I don't have a scooter unless I've like just gotten out of the hospital or something and I'm trying to rehab. So so she looked at me. We were talking about our care and how happy we were with the doctor and she said, but you don't even have a cane." As she was I could see why you would be envious, right? She was in a scooter. I'm in such excruciating pain 24/7 in both of my legs. My body, when I drink cold water, it hurts me in my organs. I feel it in my organs, right? Going down. Oh,
Mm.
and the piranhas attacking me. And I rode horses competitively my whole life since I was 9 years old. When you talk about being distracted from the pain, when you're on a horse, every stride is mindful meditation. Every stride. It is pure joy. And let me tell you, talk about core strength and riding a 1,270-pound animal. And I trained horses, and I mean, pure joy, pure strength. I mean, absolute fun. I can't do it anymore because of this dumb spasticity. So I'm going to do it though, pivoting just a little bit because this study, bam, I'm
Well, you know,
telling
I
you,
mean,
we're going to get healing.
yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that, again, it's tough, it's not an aspersion against our community, but it's tough because I have people walk up to me sometimes and they'll say, "Well, my wife is doing really badly. She can't get out of bed, or she's in a scooter, or she's in a wheelchair." And I look at you and I just think, "Wow, I just wish she was like that." And I say, "Don't you do that? Don't wish someone else's symptoms on someone else because you have no idea what you're wishing for." You know,
That's
right now, does she complain about being in pain 24 hours a day? He says, "Well, no, but she's at, her legs are spastic." I said, "Well, let me just tell you something. Mine are too."
right,
And,
right.
but I have pain that goes along with it. And again, if I focus in on it, it's, it will make me go back to my original diagnosis. And when this all first started, it makes me cry. There's nothing else I can do because I can't keep my brain away from the fact that I hurt so much. So, we all have this in a different way. And I think your assessment and analysis was an analogy was really pretty profound. I mean, one of the things I often tell people is that MS is such a strange disease. Our brains are like computers, and if I were to take a cup of water and pour it on the letter Y on my computer and let it drip down in between the letters, my computer will malfunction differently than if you poured the same amount of water at the exact same spot because the water may have got a different electrode or a different one. So therefore, we can't really compare. The only comparison is the fact that we know that the damage that we have in our brains and our spinal cords is what's causing all the symptoms. And depending on how much damage is in spot A, spot B, spot C, the symptoms
Yeah.
can be different for all of us. So, Mary, what was your life like? I mean, were you working? Were you just a mother? What were you doing at the time that you felt like you needed to get a diagnosis?
I was working for the largest privately held software company in the world, and it was number 1 on the Fortune list. I was very, uh, had a great career. I was working and doing very well. Um, and, so very motivated, very driven, very and I would work all day and work very hard. And I had a great social network. And then I managed a boarding horse barn and would go and clean 12 stalls after work and train a horse. I very hard work, and I get home at 10 p.m. And so, very active,
And did that stay, or did you continue to do that once you got your
Yes,
diagnosis? You did?
yes, 100%. I mean, the day I got my diagnosis, I just went back to work.
Got it.
Yeah, a very, very hardworking person.
Was
Just
that a
head
was that
down, work, 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 never
was that
stop.
was that one of those "oh woe is me" moments though? Did you ponder it psychologically? Did you think through it? What went through your mind?
Oh, when I got diagnosed? Oh, good
Yeah.
grief. Yeah. Oh my God. Well, the same day I got diagnosed was the same day I got my job offer in San Francisco to transfer, which was a huge dream of mine. So I had to decline the offer the same exact day. It was 3 hours later. So it was very devastating. So I sat and stared at a wall by myself, and when I got diagnosed, and of course, yeah, I've pondered this diagnosis for 25 years. I mean, every single day. And I have tried to make sense of it, and live with it. And I struggle with it every day.
You- Yeah, but
But
you also describe yourself as a kind of like it's a part of your nature to be a fighter.
oh yeah, am I a fighter? Oh yeah, determined, formidable, never give up. I'm a fighter, but it doesn't mean I don't struggle. And things have gotten more difficult with this MS. I mean, I've been hospitalized 8 times, for being crippled and blind,
Let,
but I
let's talk.
never gave up.
Let's talk a little bit about that because I mean, with some people, it's really, my illness seems to have stayed. When I say the same, literally, I have been on a roller coaster, but a roller coaster within a range. It just seems to not go beyond that range, but it goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, depending on, and really, there's no rhyme or reason. It just does that. So take me on your journey for the last 25 years. So after the diagnosis,
It's really
you
long.
could I know that's a long journey, but were there phases where you said you were hospitalized 8 times, but there were or was each hospitalization for the same thing? Let's back up a little. Let's go back to okay. So you get diagnosed 6 months later. What happened?
Well, I just kept motoring, and I was actually going to the gym, going to aerobics, going to kickboxing, walking. I was running, jogging. I just had the pain. I just had the pain. I had Lermite syndrome when you bend your neck down. I got diagnosed with, I have spinal cord lesions all the way. Well, right now I have 17 vertebrae with significant spinal cord lesions.
And they would call that lateral sclerosis, correct? Because multiple sclerosis mostly is defined for the lesions in their brain. Lateral being once they're in your neck and below, right?
They called it MS when I
Okay,
got diagnosed 25 years ago, and I started with cervical spine lesions, very
got it.
large ones all the way down. They called it
Got it.
MS.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah.
So,
I kept
you,
going. I
okay,
never stopped. I just kept going. And I was riding horses and working. I just had a lot of pain. Um,
gotcha. So
yeah.
that continued the first year, the second year.
So 2 years later, um, there was a vice president at my company that also had MS, and I went to talk to him about the MS one time because I really wanted to go to San Francisco from North Carolina. And he said, "Mary," he said, "I'm gonna tell you something." He said, "My advice to you is never let fear be a deciding factor in your decisions in life." And I took that advice very, very to heart. He was a wonderful man, and he is a wonderful man with multiple sclerosis. I confided in him. I didn't tell anybody about my MS, by the way. Okay? I really kept it private, and this is why this is very new to me, what I'm doing with you right now. He I took that to heart, and so 2 years later, I applied for a transfer to San Francisco, and I knew there were a lot of hills and a lot of stairs, and I said, "I don't know if I can do it, if I make it for a year, hopefully it'll be the time of my life." And doggone it, if I didn't make it 15 years out of there, and let me tell you, it was the time of my life. I got hospitalized several times out there with massive MS attacks. I but I always bounced back. And I just kept going with the flow. Just deal with it. Just live the life. Was it easy? No. Did I enjoy San Francisco and Marin County? Just it was what I wanted to do. I just let life happen. It's not an easy journey, but I did it.
So, but what sent you to the hospital the first time? You were obviously going through an episode or a bout or a exacerbation.
A big ol' MS attack. I couldn't walk. I couldn't walk. I was dragging my feet all over the place. I think I couldn't feed myself either with my arms. So when I got out, I had to have my neighbors feed me.
Oh, Okay. And how long were you in the hospital the first time?
Just 3 nights, just on 1,000 milligrams of Solu-Medrol for 3 nights, which is steroids.
Right. Right.
It's rough. That's rough.
Okay. And then the second time.
Uh, Same sort of thing. Uh, there's been so many. It was always 3 to 4 nights in the hospital on 1,000 milligrams a day of Solu-Medrol. I've had so many steroids. It's insane.
Gotcha.
Sometimes I couldn't see, double vision, freeze frames, like stumbling, crawling, dragging myself, sliding around.
You've had to navigate through a myriad of treatments, have you not?
I'm on the 7th one. I'm on the last one available to me. Yes.
Okay. All right.
And one of them, I had a massive, massive, massive side effect that actually kind of almost killed me. And I got in JAMA neurology, and I was hospitalized terribly, tragically for that, because I had more damage in 3 months in my brain, the number of lesions more in 3 months than I'd ever gotten in 17 years. That set me back horribly. That's devastating. That's devastating.
Understood.
That's a bad one.
And I understand why you feel it the way you do right now, because again, as I said before, people do not understand. And in some ways I apologize for kind of making you relive this. So let's move on past it.
Yeah.
And that's
Well,
also what's helped to reinforce that fighter spirit that you have, correct? Because you proved to yourself that, you even at the worst you can overcome, right?
yeah. Well, that's a bad one because I couldn't understand things for a long time. Like, I was going to like appointments on the wrong days and the wrong times, and I still do actually, because I got such severe issues in my brain. And oh, and they tried to do a spinal tap, and it took them 17 tries. That
Oh,
that was really
brutal.
traumatic.
Yeah,
That was a bad one. It was on Christmas Eve. There's a lot of trauma involved with MS.
sure. No
I have
question.
a lot of memories of things, um, but the number of the amount of damage that I incurred there, because I'm a real numbers person. I have an economics degree, and I've always been very good at math, and I couldn't balance my checkbook for like 2 years
Mm.
after that one. I'm back though. I'm back. I'm good now, but it took years. That one
I
was
mean, I guess, to ask this question is kind of a silly one, but did it not reinforce in you that you have the ability to not necessarily bounce back, but the ability to at least thrive at your best when the attacks aren't happening, right?
when they're not happening.
Yeah, when the attacks aren't happening, you can live your best life, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, to be honest with you, after that, I was still able to ride my horse. The funny thing is, I couldn't tell the difference between right and left after that. I mean, it was I mean, that thing just creamed me.
Right.
So when you show in dressage, which is what I do, it's an Olympic sport. I'm not at that level, but I was really getting up there. You do these lead changes, like where the horse looks like it's skipping, and my instructor would be like, "Okay, right, left," and I'd get them all confused all the time. But it was a blast. I mean, and I rode all the time, so I could still do it. And yeah, I was still riding and competing and stuff. I could still do it. Yeah, it was. Yeah, so it was. Yeah, that was a tough one. Yeah, that was a tough question for me. There's a lot of that was bad, but yeah, I still came back. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
still, and yeah.
And you reached out to our podcast to bring awareness to a really important study to advance treatment options for those of us with MS.
Uh,
Where did you hear about this study?
Oh, from Dr. Saida from Johns Hopkins, where I go to get great medical care. Yeah.
Okay. Well, here, I'm going to have him join us right now.
Yeah.
Please welcome Dr. Saida from Johns Hopkins. Again, Dr. Saida, thank you so much for being here and being a part of Free Thinking with Montel. Your work at Johns Hopkins has been pioneering, to say the least. For our listeners who might not be familiar, could you perhaps just explain a little bit of the basics of MS and the significance of your current research?
Sure. So first of all, it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. And it's actually really touching to listen to both of you talk about some of your personal experiences. The I'm and I You kind of laid the background for what it is that I'm trying to achieve, because both of you have given this kind of background of a story where at front value or face value, you may seem fine, right? But yet you're carrying around symptoms, and these symptoms that you carry are a form of disability. And the disability that people get from MS is different from one individual to another. And there are a number of different things that contribute towards the disability, but one of the principal things that occurs as part of the disease process is that the immune system, this is what we believe is the primary driver, is that the immune system misrecognizes parts of the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, as being foreign and attacks it. And the main thing that we think is that's under attack is something called myelin, which is the insulation that's wrapped around the wires or the cables that nerve cells use to speak to one another within the central nervous system. And so when that myelin gets attacked, some of it gets stripped away. And that's called demyelination. So this condition is referred to as a demyelinating disorder. Now, many of the wires or cables that survive these attacks, they may be left with either no or insufficient amounts of myelin. So some myelin is put back around the wires or cables, but often that myelin is dysfunctional or just not present in the correct amount. And so as I listen to both of you kind of talk about the things that aggravate, your personal experience of symptoms, and you described this narrow range where things go up and down, some of that is related to kind of energy reserve in the context of the architecture that's present just not being able to function right. And so a lot of the treatments that we currently have, and the highly effective treatments that we have, they're very good at staving off relapses, right? Focal inflammatory activity. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit, Montel, in the sense of, well, things are better when you're not having relapses. But there are still background persistent damage which is present, and we're not repairing it. So one of the big goals, apart from trying to stop relapses, which is defined as the development of new symptoms related to MS inflammation that lasts for at least 24 hours, as well as trying to stop new lesion development, which we think is due to inflammation, is to try to subserve some sort of repair. So if we could put back that myelin around the wires or cables that are still present or that have survived those previous episodes of attack, then we may be able to restore some function. And the other side of it is, and I think both of you kind of beautifully characterized this, and it's really touching to hear your individual stories, but we're actually not good at treating, unfortunately, a lot of the symptoms that people carry. So while we're really, we've got these whole slew of treatments that target inflammation, when we talk about the hidden symptoms, and it's not really a very good term. You hear a lot of MS specialists and even patients refer to hidden symptoms. There's nothing hidden about them because you're carrying them and experiencing them. But profound fatigue.
Probably non-visual would be a better term.
Non-visual is probably a much better term. Because they're very experienced, but things like fatigue and pain, bowel and bladder dysfunction, subtle types of weakness, or even more profound types of weakness. If we could potentially put some of this myelin back around these wires or cables, hopefully we might be able to restore function. And you might say, okay, so have there things being developed that could potentially promote remyelination? And the answer to that question is yes, there's lots of things that have been developed that could promote remyelination. Um, there are many compounds in animal models of MS, and I'll just say that up front that the animal models of MS, it's not that animals are getting MS, but we have ways to mimic the disease in animals. None of those animal models are perfect representations of what are actually happening in people, but at least in those animal models, many different compounds, and they're not. I should say that not every intervention that has been developed is pharmacologic. There are some non-pharmacologic interventions that have been developed as well, appear to promote remyelination. And so there's a specific type of cell that sits in the brain called the oligodendrocyte progenitor cell, or OPC. And so there are ways to turn those cells on to actually start to differentiate and then potentially proliferate to actually become mature myelin producing cells. But then the roadblock has been, if with all these various different things that have been developed, is bringing them into clinical testing. When you talk about an anti-inflammatory therapy, the mainstay type of treatments that I'm sure both of you are more than familiar with, there's very defined outcomes that are used in clinical trials, like so phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. When you're trying to promote repair through remyelination, well, you're not looking at inflammation outcomes anymore. And so you now need to have some way to test whether you're actually achieving the desired impact of remyelination. And so that is something that has been a huge roadblock that has prohibited and prevented and has frankly held many companies back who have developed drugs and interventions for remyelination to actually bring them into clinical trial testing. And so
but for some of those issues, doctor, maybe you ought to explain it, is the fact that to remyelinate the damaged myelin areas of, let's say, one of the wires, we haven't really figured out yet how we just get that spot without causing too much myelin in other areas. Is that right?
So that may be one part of it. I think that's an excellent thought process. I think the other part of it, though, is, and we do think that from the animal models that when these cells that are able to produce myelin because they're sitting there in our brains, these progenitor cells are sitting there, but they're in a quiescent or a quiet state. So we believe that if they can be taken out of that quiet state, and there are ways to do that, that they can start to become functional in identifying the areas where there isn't enough myelin and putting it back. And so it doesn't seem like, at least in the animal models, that there's an excess amount of myelin that's put down in other areas. However, we can't say that that's not going to happen in people, because we haven't actually successfully had a proper remyelination study. Well, let me rephrase that. We haven't had one that's been like really potently remyelinating, at least in clinical trials. But even, let's just go back to your comment, because I think this is really important. Imagine if we did put the myelin back, right? If we're able to find ways to put it back, and I think we have found ways to potentially do this. We don't have ways to test in people that's actually happened in a way that's robust. So how do we actually prove that we're doing what we think we're doing, apart from clinical outcomes, right? So like looking at clinical improvement. But if I even take a lot of the scales that are FDA approved, it would take quite a lot of shift or change and repair that for the FDA to potentially say, yeah, you know what, this is actually a real thing. But for a person, it may actually be very substantial. And so we are at Johns Hopkins very committed to trying to find ways to measure myelin content, or the amount of insulation that's present within the central nervous system, and particularly using novel types of magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI techniques, that will allow us to measure whether we're putting myelin back. The other thing is, you can only put myelin back around wires or cables that are actually present, because when that inflammation or those attacks occur, I mentioned that some of the wires or cables survive those attacks, but the counterverse of that is that some of the wires or cables do not survive those attacks and they die. And so that is that there's an immediate amount of tissue injury and degeneration that occurs. And so we don't actually know, for example, when a new lesion develops, and just go back to, let's imagine it's the first time that either of you have presented and you've never have another event after that, because you're put now fortunately we do have we have treatments that are pretty good at staving off further inflammatory episodes. But we don't know what the dynamics are in terms of what's the rate at which the myelin degenerates in a new area that has developed. We don't know the rate at which new myelin is put back. We don't know the factors that actually are necessary for predicting whether a lesion will have remyelination by itself, even without any intervention. And then the other thing is we don't know exactly how much wire or axonal content needs to be present within a lesion in order to allow remyelination to occur. And so there are multiple different factors that or questions that we need answers to if we're going to really move the needle. And you might say, well, what do you mean by move the needle? And I will say something very personal. And the reason why listening to you, both of you, kind of like speaks to me a lot and resonates is a lot of the times, and maybe I'm just at this stage in my career where my attitude has kind of changed a little bit. We kind of like pat ourselves on the back and say, look, we're doing a great job. You're not having relapses. Your MRI scans are stable. You're not having new lesion development. We're not really making anyone better. And just to your point, both of your points, you're carrying around this burden and disability, and there isn't really a good opportunity, or hasn't been a good opportunity, to improve the actual functional status of people with this condition, even if we're good now at controlling the inflammatory aspects of it. And so it's really something that I believe is critical. The future of care of people with MS, it can't just be focused on anti-inflammatory therapies. There has to be this kind of component of addressing these other elements of the disease, not just remyelination. That's of course a very important thing, but even neuroprotection, separate to remyelination. In other words, there may be other factors that contribute towards ongoing tissue degeneration in the brains of people with MS. This is another thing that's complicated, because oftentimes people feel with MS, they're on a highly effective therapy and they feel well. By feeling well, I mean they feel like things are status quo. They carry a certain amount of disability and nothing's changing. And then for unclear reasons, things start to deteriorate. And they start to accumulate. The pre-existing symptoms that they have sometimes start to be experienced more and more and more. And so they start to kind of go into this, I don't want to call it a progressive phase of the disease, because for everybody it's not a progressive phase of the disease, but they do start to progress to an extent. And so we also need ways to tackle that. And I think the way to do that, apart from remyelination, which causes secondary neuroprotection, is to have primary neuroprotective type of strategies. And again, we lack really good outcomes for neatly looking at tissue degeneration at an ultrastructural level using MRI techniques. And so my colleagues and I at Johns Hopkins have been involved in developing some novel MRI techniques to also facilitate the assessment of neuroprotection as well. But I think for me, the future is kind of like three things. Hopefully the safest type of anti-inflammatory therapy that you can be on, but also combined with strategies for achieving neuroprotection and repair, i.e. remyelination.
Well, now this particular study that you were working on right now, and it's been very hard for you to launch. Could you talk a little bit, expand about the goals are going to be what you just said, but are there particular techniques? Is there a new medication? What is it?
Yeah, so they right now this is predominantly focused on the development of new types of techniques which are MRI-based techniques for assessing demyelination, remyelination, neurodegeneration, and neuroprotection. And also a technique for looking at a activated type of immune cell that we think may be important in contributing to some of this progression that I mentioned that occurs in people with MS who seem to be quiet from the point of view of not having relapses or traditional MRI changes. And we're going to try to determine the interplay between this immune cell or this group of immune cells, demyelination, and then tissue degeneration, but in a very high resolution, sophisticated manner, so that we can then take this kind of bottleneck or road stop out of the way to facilitate proper remyelination and neuroprotection clinical trials.
And when you're talking about the new techniques, you're talking about using basically, I guess, spectroscopy, right? And looking at the cells that way through an MRI. I did an MRI, I'm going to tell you, it's close to 20 years ago in Prague, back when Prague had one of the most powerful MRIs on the planet. And I sat in an MRI machine for 8 hours. I will never forget this experience in my life. And they ended up doing like a 3-dimensional spectroscopy analysis of my brain. With something like that, is that what you're talking about, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can go into the mechanics of it a little bit more. So actually, traditionally, there's a thing called diffusion tensor imaging, which is used to look at the wires or cables, one of the issues with it is that there's a lack of sensitivity and specificity for what it is we're actually measuring. We're not sure if we're looking at axons. Sometimes we're not sure if we're looking at myelin. Then you can take that one step further, which we are. But actually we're going to bring it another step as well. So you can do what's called multi-shell diffusion MRI, where you can start to assemble pictures of the way all of the tracks or all these wires or cables in the nervous system are kind of bundling and moving like from one area to another to see what the connectivity is like. And then you can do something called tensor encoded diffusion MRI, this is pretty novel and very new. What happens in that is that the tensor value is actually being varied quite a lot, and this is probably allows one of the kind of neatest measures of the integrity of the wires or cables at an ultrastructural level. So I do have, for example, an NIH grant specifically looking at how the connectivity and failure of connectivity drives tissue degeneration in people with MS. And what we did find is that this micro FA or fractional anisotropy that's derived from this tensor encoded diffusion MRI correlates much more strongly with all of the clinical outcomes in patients with MS than the older and newer types of diffusion MRI techniques. Then for myelin content, a lot of it has been primarily based off of DTR, MTR, which again lacks some sensitivity, but it's one of the longest standing things that's been present. There have been some newer techniques that have been developed, like myelin free water imaging, quantitative T1 susceptibility mapping, but some of the issues with those is that they either have reproducibility, reliability problems, they're difficult to implement, or there is a lack of sensitivity to myelin specifically. We have a technique called quantitative susceptibility mapping, where we can break that up into its positive and negative magnetic sources, and one represents myelin, and the other actually represents iron-laden microglia, and I can come back to that. That's actually one of the immune cells that I was referring to. If we go back to the myelin part of it, we're able to then look at myelin content pretty much wherever we want. So it's and it's not, and so we we can apply it to all lesions, a lesion. We can apply it to just gray matter, which is the outside part of the brain, white matter, which is the inside part of the brain, deep gray matter structures. And that allows us to then look at what's the relationship between myelin content, for example. And I have a specific interest in eye things, by the way, because I've done a lot of my career has been spent looking at retinal imaging. So I could potentially take a lesion that's present in the back part of the brain, which is part of the visual pathways, and then see what the myelin axon content is and how that relates to changes in the actual retina and function of the retina, as an example. The iron-laden microglia thing is interesting. There's a lot of interest in, this is the other part of the quantitative susceptibility mapping. There's a lot of interest in looking at activated microglia. And by the way, none of our current MS treatments properly target activated microglia. And so there's a big interest in therapies that might be able to target this, because we think that overactivation of bad microglia, because they're not all bad, right? Not all immune cells are bad. Some of them subserve extremely important functions. But overactivation of bad microglia may over time contribute to some of the ongoing tissue damage. So this is the other thing it's probably become clear, hopefully clear to anyone who's listening to this. And I don't want to get too lost in some of the technical jargon. This is an extremely complicated condition. Not only does it affect every person differently. There's a general consensus that even within a person, each lesion may be behaving differently, and the way that it formed may have been different, and the consequences of that particular lesion after it formed may be different. So not all lesions, even in the same person, are equal. And these are things that we really need to kind of dig into to really understand if we're going to be successful at all in terms of moving forward with remyelination and neuroprotection trials.
So, Doc, if there are people who have been watching and listening and they want to get involved, or is it a study that you're doing? Can people volunteer to be a part of that study? What?
Yeah, I mean, so this specific kind of goal here is to try to generate funding in order to study lesions as they develop. In other words, if we take like a lesion from when it's born and then look at it kind of frequently, with MRI to see what the mechanics or dynamics are of natural change that's clinically meaningful, so that we're able to kind of reverse engineer that information so that we can then figure out exactly what the parameters are that are going to serve us best for truly identifying, successful remyelination signals in clinical trials. So the kind of hope is to bring up, if anything, I actually think this has already been a success, because the point really is to highlight the necessity for treatments that go beyond just targeting the immune system, and to achieve repair, remyelination, and neuroprotection, and for not just myself and our center, but other centers to really put the time and energy into developing proper outcomes for clinical trials, so that we can just change the landscape of future treatment of this condition.
So if people wanted to get involved, then clearly what you need is donations. What you need is some money, some funding, because that seems to be the tipping point for almost all of these kinds of things. Where can people go?
Yeah, so actually there is a website that has been developed at Johns Hopkins, and Mary is also involved in this as well. And so it's going to be possible to provide donations there. You're right. I mean, these MRI techniques are expensive, this is the other point of where the money comes, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people maybe, and I wonder if perhaps you are aware of this, but like if you were to conduct a phase 2 clinical trial in North America for MS, you're probably looking at somewhere in the ballpark of about 50 million. if you want to conduct a phase 3 clinical trial, which is what the FDA kind of requires for regulatory approval, you're looking in the ballpark of about 300 to 500 million. And the cost, a lot of the cost comes from the primary outcomes that are being used or the secondary outcomes. And so if it's an MRI-based outcome, for example, for a phase 2, you really want to have your MRI outcome hammered down as best as possible. This is where a lot of the roadblock has come in terms of like transitioning from the animal models to actual clinical trials. And fortunately, I'm not the only one, and we're not the only center that know this and are trying to tackle this. And like both of you and everybody listening is aware, it takes a village. It's going to take a lot of kind of collective effort across groups and centers to really move the needle and make this happen.
Do you have a specific website that people can go to? What is that, and what is it?
Yeah, that is a Johns Hopkins based website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So just go to Johns Hopkins. What I say, Johns Hopkins clinical trial. How do I do it?
Yeah. So you're just going to be able to Google remyelination trial Johns Hopkins and put in Shibsida, and it should pop up.
Okay. All right, Mary. Like reflecting on your advocacy for this, I mean, I think honestly, any breakthroughs like this would probably be, tantamount to first level care for you. I mean, how has the experience of being involved with Dr. Saida help you, from an emotional standpoint, understand that you may be contributing not necessarily to something that's going to help you, but something that's going to help somebody in the future?
Yeah. This experience for me has been, it's been new because I've never talked publicly about my condition. Kind of like you, Montel, I like to stay focused on other things, to not focus on my MS, and so it's difficult, it's a challenge, but a challenge I'm willing to take because it's so important. And one thing Dr. Saida, I think, didn't mention is that there's a huge group of therapies waiting in the wings right now. Therapies, I mean, I'm going to reiterate this, and medicine that want to go to trial but cannot do it because there isn't a way to measure the effectiveness to then get the FDA to approve.
Yeah, what I got to tell you, Dr. Saida, I have been in this pathway. I've been down this path. I've helped to take a medical device for MS through to FDA approval. I have been in some ways just, I don't know. I don't know which the best term to say. I literally do not understand, and I've been in the process. I've actually been involved with raising $100 million to break through all those clinical trials to get FDA approval, and have done so for a device that's now is in the marketplace as we speak. I am sometimes just jaded by the cost because some of these costs are so exorbitant unnecessarily. And I mean, I'm sorry, I know you're a clinician and this is what you need to do and you need to raise money. But at some point in time, I think we're going to have to figure out a way that, there are thousands of different modalities in America that need money. There aren't enough people to be able to donate enough money to hit every single one of these targets for every single malady that exists that needs $300 to $400 million. At some point in time, it's going to take doctors like yourself and institutions like Johns Hopkins to say, stop, enough is enough. We've got to bring the price down for some of this stuff so that we can at least, I kind of get it, okay? And I understand the whole process, IRBs, I understand recruitment, I understand all those things that have to happen. But from my perspective, it shouldn't have to cost $7,500 per head to get a person in a clinical trial. That is ignorant to me. I'm sorry. This is now 2024, and we have AI. AI could actually speed up the entire process of recruitment for clinical trials. yet the price tag is still the same. That to me, sorry, is a sham. And we need to call out the FDA and call out those powers that be that keep requiring these numbers to keep going up. There's no reason in 2024 that any clinical trial in this planet should cost $500 million. It's ignorant. It's just, to me, and I've been speaking out about this. I'm sorry, sir. You're getting the shotgun blast, and it's not to you. It's to the industry at all. Everybody involved in these processes. I'm involved right now in helping to take 2 other platforms to full FDA approval right as we speak. And I've been trying to help, but I sometimes feel almost like I'm pushing a rope up a hill. I mean, I get you 50 million, then I got to get you another 50 million, then I get you another 50 million, another 50 million, another 50 million. You know what I mean? So tell me what you think the next 5 years look like in achieve the goals that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I actually have to respond to your comment, and then I'll respond to the next 5 years. I completely agree with you, by the way. So you may not, and you don't know this about me, although you might have been wondering as you're listening to me talk, where on earth this guy's from. I actually struggled when I first came to the US, like 15 years ago from Ireland, with the cost of everything in the health system, right? And so I was very much based and trained in a social healthcare system, where even the cost of the therapies was completely different. I couldn't understand why this drug cost $100,000 here, and it was like 10,000, euros over there, and it's the exact same drug. And why the MRI scan, which is the exact same MRI scan, was 10 times the price here. And so your frustration with the cost of the trials, I believe, is completely justified. And it's something that absolutely needs to be addressed. It's actually the thing that's driving the cost of it, at least in North America, is the cost of healthcare, unfortunately. And so that is and I'm going to say, for me right now in this moment in time, all I can say to you is that I agree and acknowledge that. And I think it's very important that it be addressed, and that you understand my kind of like social mindset from where I did come from. But it requires like a whole revamping, not just clinical trials. It requires a lot of change within the health system. This kind of study that I'm proposing to do, and that my colleagues and I shouldn't say it's just me, right? Because again, it's myself and Peter Calabrese, the two of us.
I don't know if Peter's told you, but Peter was one of my first MS doctors.
Okay, yeah. So he and I work very closely on a lot of different imaging techniques. And this is something that we both want to do. And I think that this is something that once we kick it off and we're able to get started, that we're able to turn it around, hopefully pretty quickly within about like 2 or 3 years, so that we have like these new outcomes. Now, I want to make one other kind of tag on comment, and just again, to just so you understand like my kind of train of thought. We do have other outcomes that are available for looking at myelin, but the really good ones are primarily based in the visual system. And there's an issue with that, because the issue with that may be that somebody may not have visual system issues, because the condition affects everybody differently. And so now you can only really recruit a subset of individuals with MS if they don't have visual system problems. And so while we can look at remyelination in the visual system, we can only look at it if there has been demyelination, and not everybody with MS has got visual system problems. And so that's, at least though, this remyelination studies should still be going on. They should still be occurring. And I fully support that, even using the visual system as it stands right now. And there are some, right? But again, the recruitment becomes an issue for and the feasibility of those types of studies, because now you have to exclude people who don't have visual system issues. And Like both of you have eloquently kind of outlined this condition unfortunately affects everybody in a complicated and different way. But so yes, Peter and I hope the hope is that we can turn this around pretty quickly so that we then have like novel outcomes for looking within the actual brains and not just the visual system itself.
Gotcha. Well, look, this research is a beacon of hope for everyone affected by MS. So Dr. Sada, Mary, I really want to thank you both for sharing today your insights and your experiences with us today. And for those listening, I encourage you to consider supporting this life-changing research. Together, we can make a profound impact. There's no question. Remember, folks, every day is a gift. It's up to us to make the most of it. I want to thank you all for tuning in today to Free Thinking with Montel. Remember, knowledge and power is the power. And by spreading awareness, we're one step closer to a cure. Stay strong, stay positive, keep fighting. Again, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mary. You be well. And make sure you tune in to the next edition of Free Thinking with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Free Thinking with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please send us your comments.